If you missed the first episode of this chilling tale, we highly recommend you go back and listen to it. In episode 1, we uncovered the eerie disappearance of Mano J, a dedicated worker in the haunted tea garden. Strange occurrences followed his disappearance, leading to a growing belief that something dark and supernatural was at play. But the mystery didn't stop there. In this episode, we dive deeper into the shadows of the tea garden as the disappearances continue, and the spirits of the missing workers seem to grow more restless. As the weeks passed, the unease that had settled over the garden only grew stronger. The workers, once a vibrant community, now moved through their daily tasks in silence, their eyes filled with a palpable fear. The shadows seemed to stretch longer in the tea garden, and the once soothing rustling of the leaves now felt like a constant whisper of something watching them. The strange and inexplicable events that had plagued the tea garden after Mano J's disappearance weren't just a series of coincidences, they were the beginning of something far darker. The workers were no longer sure if they were working among the living, or if something much more sinister had begun to seep into their world. In the weeks following Mano J's vanishing, another worker went missing this time. It was Ramesh. A cheerful, hard-working man, Ramesh was beloved by his fellow workers. His laughter was often heard in the rows of tea bushes, his smile a reassuring presence in the otherwise silent garden. He had been working at the garden for years, and his sudden disappearance sent waves of panic through the workers. They recalled the eerie figure that had once appeared in the garden, resembling Manoj, but now it was as if the shadows themselves had taken another soul. It was a typical evening shift when Ramesh simply vanished. He had been walking back from the main plantation area after completing his task of gathering tea leaves. The sun had long dipped behind the mountains, and the workers were preparing for the final round of the day. But when the night crew went to check on him, he was nowhere to be found. At first, it seemed like he had just gone for a walk, or maybe had some business elsewhere. They brushed it off as a minor delay, perhaps a quick errand, and continued with their work. But as the hours passed, and still no sign of him, worry began to settle in. The workers began to search the garden, calling his name into the night, but all they found were the rustling leaves, swaying unnaturally in the wind. The breeze was eerily cold, far colder than the usual mountain winds. It felt as though the air itself was charged with something unseen, pressing down on them, heavy and oppressive. The search party grew desperate, combing every inch of the garden, but Ramesh was gone. There were no traces of his footsteps, no sign of struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Not a single scrap of evidence remained, no torn clothing, no broken branches, no disturbed earth. The workers had scoured the entire garden, yet Ramesh had disappeared without a trace. As the days stretched into weeks, the rumors began to spread. Workers whispered to each other about the spirits of the garden, convinced that Ramesh had fallen victim to the same fate as Mano. Some even claimed that they had seen him, their dear Ramesh, wandering between the tea bushes, his eyes hollow, his form faint, almost as though he was trapped in another realm, lingering just beyond the veil of the living world. But no one could be sure. Was it truly Ramesh, or just another trick of the mind? It wasn't long before the unsettling events that surrounded Manoj's disappearance started to repeat themselves. The cold, unnatural chill that swept through the garden at night returned. The eerie whispers that the workers had once dismissed as their imagination now grew louder, more persistent. They could hear them coming from all directions, faint voices, murmuring in the distance, too soft to make out, but undeniably present. And then came the sightings figures in the distance, too fleeting to identify, moving among the rows of tea bushes. But when the workers rushed forward to investigate, the figures were gone, leaving only an oppressive silence in their wake. It felt like something was watching them, waiting. The workers' unease intensified. But the real horror began when, as the workers were still grappling with the mystery of Ramesh's disappearance, another tragedy struck. This time it was Priya, another young labourer who had been working at the garden for several years. Priya had always been known for her bright personality and strong work ethic. She was someone who had a unique ability to bring a smile to even the most weary workers. She was a constant presence in the garden, always willing to help others, always cheerful. But one evening, she too simply vanished. It was a quiet evening shift, much like the others. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky a deep purple. The air had cooled, and the workers were wrapping up their shifts for the day. As the last few tea leaves were plucked from the bushes, the workers began to gather and check in with one another, ensuring everyone was accounted for before leaving the garden for the night. That's when they noticed Priya was missing. At first, they assumed she had gotten caught up in some other task, or perhaps had gone to the village for a quick errand. They were used to workers leaving early or taking their time, but as time wore on, anxiety took hold. Priya was nowhere to be found. They searched, called her name, but there was no sign of her. The garden, once filled with the buzz of activity, was now eerily quiet. The wind had died down, and the whispers from earlier in the day had vanished. The search was again fruitless. No sign of Priya anywhere, no footsteps, no clues. It was as though she had simply ceased to exist. The workers began to feel a creeping sense of dread, and fear swept through the team. Some workers began to panic, recalling the previous disappearances, and they couldn't shake the feeling that Priya had become another victim of the dark force that had taken Manoj and Ramesh. As the days passed and no word of Priya's whereabouts came, the dread only deepened. The locals began to avoid the tea garden altogether. They, too, believed that something sinister was at play. Rumors circulated that the garden was cursed, that the spirits of the missing workers were seeking revenge. Many workers who had been with the garden for years began to leave, too scared to stay any longer. Those who remained were filled with dread, unable to explain the strange events unfolding in the garden. They had seen too much, heard too much to ignore the growing sense of fear that gripped the plantation. The disappearances didn't stop. Priya's absence was just the beginning of an even darker chapter in the story of the haunted tea garden. As the workers continued to disappear, a strange sense of inevitability began to take hold. It was as though they were being marked one by one, and with each disappearance, the shadows seemed to grow longer, the voices louder, and the oppressive atmosphere thicker. Soon, a paranormal investigation team arrived in the area, seeking to understand the strange occurrences that were unsettling the workers. The team consisted of experienced investigators, armed with cameras, audio equipment, and paranormal tools to measure the energy in the garden. They set up their equipment one fateful night, hoping to capture something, anything, that could explain the mysterious disappearances. The team was skeptical at first. After all, missing workers could be explained by any number of natural causes. But they quickly learned that the supernatural forces at play in the garden were far more than just rumors. Air was thick with an unnatural energy. The temperature had dropped to an alarming degree, and the garden seemed to hume with an invisible tension. The team set up cameras in various parts of the plantation, recording every corner of the land where the workers had vanished. What happened next would confirm the workers' worst fears. The investigators, equipped with a night vision camera, was walking through the dense tea bushes when something caught his eye. In the distance, between the rows of tea plants, he saw a figure. First, he thought it was one of the workers, but as he got closer, he realized something was terribly wrong. The figure was translucent, flickering in and out of sight, almost as if it was being pulled between the living world and another realm. It moved slowly, its movements deliberate, like it was aware of being watched but unable to acknowledge the living. Called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it drifted further into the darkness, its form growing fainter with each passing second. The investigator moved cautiously closer, but before he could reach the spot where the figure had been, it vanished, leaving only the rustling of the leaves in its wake. The investigator's breath quickened as he realized what he had just witnessed. The truly disturbing part came when the investigators reviewed their footage later that night. As they played back the audio from the cameras, they heard a faint voice. First, it was barely audible, but as they enhanced the sound, it became clear. The voice was chanting something, in a language no one could recognize. And then, at the end of the recording, a single word stood out: help. Investigators were shaken. Evidence was irrefutable. Spirits of the workers who had disappeared were indeed present in the garden, their souls trapped between the living and the dead. And as the weeks passed, the disappearances continued. More workers vanished, each one swallowed by the darkness that seemed to rule the plantation. And claimed they had seen them before they disappeared, still working, still going about their tasks. But they were always distant, their eyes glazed over, as if they were no longer truly there. The workers had become shadows, lost in a world they couldn't escape. And then, just like the others, they vanished without a trace. At this point, the remaining workers were terrified. No one wanted to be the next to vanish, but no one dared leave either. The fear had taken hold so deeply that the workers felt trapped, bound to the haunted garden that seemed to hold them captive. Was the garden cursed? Spirits of the workers trapped between the living world and the afterlife? Or was there something more sinister at play, something darker than anyone could have imagined? The garden's dark history continues to unfold. With every disappearance, the mystery deepens, and the supernatural grip on the workers grows stronger. Who or what is behind the hauntings? And will the truth ever come to light? Join us next time as we delve further into the supernatural forces at work in the garden. In the next episode, we'll explore the chilling connection between the missing workers and uncover a secret hidden within the heart of the garden that might finally explain why the spirits won't rest. The haunting is far from over. Will the truth behind the missing workers ever come to light? To find out, make sure to tune in to the next episode. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts and theories on the mystery of the haunted tea garden. Stay tuned and join us again as we dive deeper into the dark secrets that lie within.